Is the board game hobby dead? Or is it even dying, for that matter? That's the question I want to go over with you today. I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and I was recently watching a video from Board Game Bullocks, a fantastic channel that I highly recommend, both informative and entertaining in a variety of ways, and he was talking about kind of the state of the hobby to a degree. I'll link to it down below. But a big part of it was kind of this doom and gloom aspect of how the hobby is less innovative. It's constantly putting out old things, with new packaging on them, ways to just get you to buy new stuff without actually being innovative in any way. This is even more interesting when Neon Gorilla, another channel I respect, and I'll link to that down below as well, did a commentary video on that, kind of agreeing with elements of that proposition. The idea that there were less exciting games coming out this year, less things that were amazing, and even those that came out are rehashes of already existing games out there, and it's just this kind of somewhat negative state of the hobby. Is the board game hobby dying? Have we lost all innovation? Is it just rehashes, deluxifications, and all these things that are just not that interesting, and the glory days that once were are finally gone? We're going to be going over all of that today, but first, thank you to the channel sponsor, Allplay, a site where you can get an absolute ton of things from board games to bags to shells, and they also make board game tables. Once you're done deciding whether the hobby is dead, assuming you are still here and interested in being a part of it, you can go ahead and check them out and get a custom board game table or one of their pre-constructed board game tables, a variety of different options at a variety of different budgets. Check them out at allplay.com. But with that, the biggest and most complicated part of this is how do you define the death of a hobby, or the death of our hobby? What marks the death? Because I pulled up a bunch of statistics of different ways to kind of get a sense of is there a great deal of decline? Are we seeing decline in any way? And I pulled up 5 different metrics. Technically, was it 4? No, it was 4 different metrics I pulled up to kind of try to measure the death of the hobby. And some have declined, some less so, but it's just an interesting comparison between 2024 and 2025. Because in 2024, we had 8,000 games come out. If you exclude expansions, that was 5,800 games. So 5,800 games, 8,000 if you include expansions, that's what came out in 2024. In 2025, there's 6,300 games, or 8,700 if you exclude expansions, that came out. This is calculated using Board Game Geek and just searching through the amount of games that came out that year. That is 5,800 versus 6,300, or 8,000 versus 8,700 if you're including expansions. That is an increase, a decent increase in the number of games. Now, granted, all these comparisons are going to be just 2024, 2025. We'll talk about that later. But there's definitely an increase in the number of games, so at least in that sense, doesn't seem to be dying. Granted, I don't think quantity is a good measure of whether the hobby is growing, but it's certainly it's not a good measure of how good the hobby is, but it certainly is a measure of whether the hobby is growing or not. Additionally, from there, if you filter it down, because I am curious, what if you filter it down to ratings? What if you filter it to only games that are rated a 7.6 or above with at least 50 ratings? It's a completely arbitrary number, but I always consider 7.6 to be kind of the grading of a really good game on Board Game Geek. Well, then, when you compare 2024 to 2025, there were 292 games with those criteria, a 7.6 and 50 ratings, that came out in 2024, versus 273 games in 2025. So there is a decline to some small amount, 292 to 273, of the quantity of the higher rated, better recognized games that came out last year to this year. Again, definitely a decline, not a huge one, but a decline nonetheless. But if you go even further, if you take the top 10 games, now the way I did this, the whole long reason as to the way I did it, I'll tell you why I did it this way, but the way I did this is I went to boardgameoftheyear.org, fantastic site, I'll link to it down below. I took the highest rated 10 games in 2024 and the highest rated 10 games in 2025. I then pulled up the BGG ratings for this. The reason I did that is because if you go to BGG and you try to just pull up the highest rated, you get a ton of extra fluff in there that kind of represent big boxes or other things. This is the easiest way for me to get to remove my judgment from the equation while having a clear consensus that I can go by. But the highest rated games, highest 10 games of 2024 from boardgameoftheyear.org, and then taking those and taking their average BGG rating, and the average BGG rating for those top 10, the absolute best 10, was an 8.103 in 2024 is the average rating, versus an 8.188, slightly higher, in 2025. Again, marginal impacts. I don't think these have any great measure, but it certainly doesn't seem to indicate a great decline in the quantity of the very best of the best games that have come out last year versus this year. And even if you look at those games, because in 2024 we had Bomb Busters, going from 10 to 1, it was Bomb Busters, Fromage, Unconscious Mind, Let's Go to Japan, Andromeda's Edge, Slay the Spire, Harmonies, Lord of the Rings Duel, SETI, and Arcs were the 10 games. And I'll talk about, well, I'll do the 10 games there. In 2025, it was Speakeasy, Luthier, Take Time, Moon Colony, Toy Battle, Hot Streak, Elder Scrolls, Vantage, Fate of the Fellowship, and Galactic Cruise. Now, if you look at those categories, especially because we're talking about things like re-implementations, we're talking about deluxifications, rehashings, if you look at those, within both those categories, what's interesting is both of those top 10 have 2 IPs, intellectual properties attached to them, and both of them have 2 re-implementations, taking an existing game and doing a version of that. In 2024, the IPs were Slay the Spire and Lord of the Rings Duel, and the re-implementations were Andromeda's Edge, which is a rehashing of Dwellings of Eldervale, and then Lord of the Rings Duel, which is a re-implementation of Seven Wonders Duel. So 2 IPs and 2 re-implementations last year. This year, or 2025, so I guess last year, 2025, there were again 2 IPs and 2 re-implementations. This time it was Elder Scrolls was the IP, as well as being a re-implementation of Too Many Bones. And that's debatable, but it certainly is built on that framework to a small degree. And then Fate of the Fellowship is, again, an IP and a re-implementation. It's Fate of the Fellowship built on the pandemic system. I would argue that both of those re-implementations are much looser than the prior ones, 2024, but nonetheless, top 10s, slightly higher ratings, no clear lack of anything, not a ton of rehashings. As far as innovation within those mechanics, within those, if you look at the top 10s, all of those, innovation is going to be sparse, but we're going to come back to innovation later because I think it's a conversation in its own right, in this video, not some future video. So there doesn't seem to be a big decline in 2025 versus 2024. Now, I'll grant you that maybe we're talking about the death of the hobby is a much longer conversation. Maybe we're not looking at last year. Maybe it's just that we're talking about it this year, but maybe the hobby as a general whole has been seeing this death for a while, and so comparing it to last year is a complete waste of time. An interesting one, I personally find, but maybe it's a waste of time. Maybe we need to be looking at the general state of things. Maybe the hobby was thriving in 2015. Maybe it was thriving in 2012 or 2008 or 2001. At what point do we consider the hobby to have been in its golden state, where everything was a golden era, where everything was amazing and incredible? And what are the metrics we use to define that? Because it's not clear to me that there's any clear decline in the hobby. I do think that we generally have a habit of looking at the past with rose-colored glasses. I think we have an instinct to see the best of what came before us at certain points in time, and I certainly think there are specific things you can point to that were different and have gone downhill. Crowdfunding, I didn't talk about the fourth metric. Crowdfunding has seen a decline 2024-2025. Crowdfunding is down 7.5%. Again, not extreme, but certainly present. I think very easily explainable given the state of the world, given tariffs and all those things. I think it makes sense, but nonetheless, that's certainly a decline. I also think that when I personally think of the golden age of board gaming, what I often think of is I think crowdfunding certainly had a magic to it that has been lost to a certain degree. I think that it used to be you can get great deals on crowdfunding left, right, and center, and now it's much harder to get things that make sense that you should be getting on crowdfunding, and very often waiting for retail is the better guess. And even if things that are better deal on crowdfunding, sometimes you don't need that many boxes. I'll link to Chris George down below, Chris George from Room Board. He did a fantastic video as well talking about crowdfunding and how he thinks crowdfunding is dead, which again, I think the death of all these things is greatly overstated, but I do think that there's elements of truth within these conversations. Because I do think that there are certain things, there's certain trends that we certainly have seen over the past few years. And I think those trends will only increase as time goes on, but I do not think that we are looking at the death of either crowdfunding. I do not think we're looking at the death of the hobby. I think we are constantly looking at changes in the ecosystem and how those things adjust and adapt. Crowdfunding has certainly seen big changes. Once upon a time, I still am a huge advocate for crowdfunding, but once upon a time I backed tons of things because it always made sense to do so. And then with COVID, and then following that with tariffs, things have become less and less of a good deal or incentive to do so. And so that charm aspect of, ooh, look at these opportunities to find these great deals, it's gone away, or at least become greatly diminished. Combine that with various companies going under in different ways, even like companies like Simon, which hasn't gone under, but certainly has seen some degree of who knows what's going on with them next, which they were like a bedrock of crowdfunding, and to see that happen is astounding. It's shocking. But I think some of the trends, or some of the conversations that are complicated. Because I think we see great games come out every single year. Fantastic games come out every single year. I think every year when you look back at the prior year, there are tons of great games that become the things we talked about from prior year. I think that to a certain extent, the death of the hobby is grumpy old man, which to a certain extent, by the way, to be fair to Board Game Deluxe, is part of his brand, so it makes sense that we would see that. But I do think that there's things to look back on and wish for. And there's changes we might see in the hobby that we might not love. But I don't think that means that we're seeing the death of the hobby by any means. Some of the big changes, the big trends that I do think we have seen more of, and we will continue to see more of, will come down to innovation, IPs, and deluxifications, rehashings, rethemes, reprints, all of those things. And let's go through all of those three, because I think the hardest one to talk about is innovation. Because I think innovation is drastically overrated. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for innovation, but it's hard to have truly innovative concepts at this point in the hobby, or at any hobby for that matter. I think that as a hobby is in its early stages, you will see things that change up the game. Oh my gosh, look at these print and plays. Look at these verb and verb, roll and write, flip and draw, all these things. Look at all these new concepts. Oh look, trick taking, which has been here and there, has suddenly come back and is now in every other game. You'll certainly see, and that even trick taking is not innovation, it's just repopularizing something that already exists. I think you'll always see changes within the ecosystem, but I think those changes become harder and harder to have actual innovation as opposed to blending of mechanics. Blending of mechanics, I think, is something that we'll see more, that you see, is that represents more of what we see nowadays that produces great games. It's less about innovation and it's far more about refining. This applies to any industry you're in, whether you're talking about board games, whether you're talking about video games, whether you're talking about movies. Like once upon a time, like twists in movies, like things like Ocean's 11, The Italian Job, The Prestige, these things blew your mind. And nowadays, because of that, it's harder to have something that's actually an interesting twist because we've seen it all. How much can you shock someone when you've trained the audience to learn that twists are a part and parcel of it? I mean, even now, this is a random tangent to when I'm filming this, Stranger Things just concluded, and the brilliant theories that are there left, right, and center is so much smarter than what the show is actually doing because you've trained an audience to be on social media and to expect these twists, and it changes the way things are done. There absolutely is always going to be changes within an ecosystem. That means that sometimes things that you got used to, you won't be able to see anymore. Going to video games, I still remember when Call of Duty 4 came out, and it defined a generation. Call of Duty 4, as a first-person shooter, was one of the best first-person shooters to ever exist. But then from thereafter, it was Call of Duty, Battlefield, Call of Duty, Battlefield, Call of Duty, Battlefield, for the next 20 years until like Arc Raiders came out and people are excited again. I mean, I'm overstating that a little bit, but the concept that sometimes things become a bit more of the norm and therefore the innovative aspect of things can get lost over time. But it doesn't mean you don't see great things. It just means that people within an industry learn what works within that industry and then try to do so as well as possible. And sometimes greatness is born from the way you combine those mechanics slightly better than someone else did. I mean, Expedition 33 came out this past year on the video game side of things and blew people's mind. Did it do anything truly amazing that other video games haven't done? Is there actual innovation within that system? It doesn't seem like there's a true amount, or Arc Raiders or any of these games, it doesn't seem like there's a true amount of innovation. It just seems like they've refined better. They've put better art into their product, but I don't mean like little art, but I also do mean little art. And that's true in board games as well. Some of the standouts we've had, again, Galactic Cruise doesn't do anything innovative, but it does do those things well together. The combination of what they put out has really worked well and has resonated with a lot of people. What was innovative? Not necessarily any one mechanic, but the full package of it produced something that was well recognized and for good reason. And so I think innovation as something to crave will often leave you wanting and nostalgic for the past. And I don't think that's a flaw of the system. I think that's just this yearning for the growth of a system before it has started to see true maturity and started to fall into some of these patterns. Will we see innovation in the future? I'm sure we will. But I don't think it's going to be frequent or extreme because we've already reached a certain level of maturity within this hobby. IPs. This is something that you're definitely going to see more of, and we have seen a lot of over the past 2 or 3 years. The IPs, intellectual properties within board games, have existed for a long time. Way back to Chaos in the Old World, that's Warhammer IP thrown on top of a board game. You have seen IPs, and you will continue to see IPs. But the extent to which intellectual properties have become a big part of some of the biggest games out there, that is something that we saw a big shift in. I want to say around 2 to 4 years ago is when it started to really take off. When it started to be that more and more board game companies realized that you can really get a good audience, you can build a good board game with a good IP on top of it, and if you show something true love and passion and create something that is wanted by the gamers and is wanted by the fans of the IP, you can really do well within it. And don't get me wrong, not every intellectual property board game does a service to the intellectual property. Sometimes they feel like not quite as great. But then again, tons of board games come out, and some are not as great, and some of those are going to be IP games. But we are seeing a growth of IPs within the industry, and I think that will only continue to be the case. This year, again, we have 2 IPs in last year's top 10. We have 2 IPs in this year's top 10. I would be I should say surprised, but I'd say my prediction, if you want a prediction from me, I think in 2026 there'll be at least 3 IPs in the top 10 games. That's not because IP games are inherently better, because I think IPs are becoming more common and more popular, and so there can be some degree of latching onto them within good board games that makes that a thing. And so I think IP growth within the industry is certainly something you're going to continue to see. We have seen already. I don't think it means the death of the hobby, but I think it does speak to more consumerism within the hobby. Because it does feel a little bit less like a passion project when you throw Slay the Spire onto something, when you throw Lord of the Rings onto something, which, by the way, random tangent, is almost an insult to Slay the Spire because that entire thing was the biggest possible passion project, but granted there's more of a consumerist nature to it that can feel like you're here to sell me on things because you're slapping that IP on things because you know that I'll want it. So it can remove some of the labor of love, even when so many companies specifically and intentionally work with IPs that are a labor of love. If you've been reading up an Arkan Studio at all, Arkan Studio, they started working with StarCraft. They're doing a StarCraft miniatures game. Like, they talk about how their goal from day one when they started as a studio was to work with StarCraft. That was the dream, and they finally achieved it. And so sometimes, yes, it's a good opportunity to make money. Other times, its fans actually have an opportunity to work with the thing that they love. But it certainly can remove some of the small town feeling that this hobby has had until now. And the last category is going to be reimplementations, reprints, deluxifications. Again, we're seeing this trend in general now. We're seeing a lot of Euros getting big box deluxified versions. It started way back when with the concept of the big box, which has existed since Alhambra big box, Shogun big box, and many, many more. But I'd say that to a certain extent, Awakened Realms with the Castle of Burgundy Special Edition certainly popularized that concept. They've continued it with Puerto Rico, they've continued it with Agricola, but you also have other companies jumping in as well. You have a lot of companies, 20th Century Games putting out Tigris and Euphrates, and Ra, deluxified versions of that. You have Steamforged Games putting out Terra Mystica. You have so many. Brass was brought back to life with Roxley, and they came before Awakened Realms. Like, there's a lot, well, not necessarily before Awakened Realms, but they did that deluxe version before. There's a lot of reprints and Euros that we're seeing where someone brings back a game, puts it in a deluxe version to repackage it and to resell it, or even re-implementations of existing systems, such as Andromeda's Edge versus Dwellings of Eldraine, such as Lord of the Rings Duel versus Lord of the Rings, Pandemic Fair of the Fellowship, putting the Lord of the Rings IP onto a Pandemic ecosystem. That's both the re-implementation and an IP. You see this more and more, and we will continue to see this more and more, because at the end of the day, selling people something that you know they like, that you know they want, having a built-in audience, that's something we see across every industry. From books to movies to video games. It is often easier to make something that you know there's an existing audience for. And so that does creep into how many of those games are repackaged versions being sold to the same audience, or expansions or iterations, 20 strong, and the 17 variations of it that there are already and that there will be more of. You're going to see more of that. All of these things, innovation, IPs, deluxified versions and reprints, I don't think that those speak to the death of the hobby. They might speak to an individual's nostalgia for a day when those things weren't concepts. And that I completely buy. I completely understand the yearning for almost a simpler time that spoke more to the purity of the hobby, because that is true. Those concepts certainly did exist. But I don't think the hobby is going anywhere. The hobby is growing from a user base standpoint. It is growing from a number of games standpoint. The quantity of the games is constantly growing. I think that there's so much growth. There's so much growth within this hobby, and there's so many great games for us to find on a regular basis. There will come a year, possibly, maybe, I don't know, where I'm just not super excited about any particular game. It's bound to happen eventually, but it hasn't happened yet. Not for me. And I imagine if you're searching, if you're looking for good games, and if you're not looking at it with those lenses of, well, nothing's good anymore, there's a lot of love to find within this hobby. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.